I'm Melanie Egan. I'm the head of the craft department here at Harbourfront Centre. This is the first installment of the Innovators and Ideas, the contemporary craft series that we have annually. And each year we curate a series of presentations supporting our exhibitions and programs. The content reflects current national and international ideas and directions relevant to contemporary craft and design practice. Peter Ivey, our speaker this evening's presentation, is in conjunction with the exhibition Homecus Domesticus at the south end of the building, and it celebrates the beauty of functional glass. So Peter Ivey is originally from Austin, Texas. He moved to Rhode Island at the age of 20, where he received his BFA from the Rhode Island School of Design, and in the following years, he apprenticed in the Seattle area and was fortunate enough to work with prominent makers such as David Levi, Dante Marioni, and Josiah McElheny, and also numerous other studios. In 1998, he returned to the Boston area to teach at R.I.S.D and Massachusetts College of Art. Interested in exploring new interests, he then moved to Japan, where he became an associate professor at Aichi University of Education as the head of the glass program. Currently located in Toyama, Japan, Peter is concentrating on making wares for daily use in his own studio, which roughly translates as Flow Laboratory. So without further ado, Peter.
Thank you very much for inviting me to come, and it's really a great honor to be here tonight and to be involved and to see what's going on here in the next few days. I've been in Japan for about 11 years now, so sometimes I get my order in the wrong words. So I'm just going to go ahead and start right away. I spent about 5 years teaching at the university, and then my wife had this great opportunity to get this job in another place, so I quit my job and built my own studio, and for the first time started doing production glassworking. I had worked for production glassworkers, but I had never actually done production myself. So the first of the presentations is the first 5 years, which was basically when I was at the school teaching, and I was just trying to figure out at that time what I was interested in about where I was at and what the place had to offer to me. When I first got there, I couldn't really speak. I couldn't speak at all. And before I had come, I was making really quite decorative stuff, with cane and making goblets and trying to do these things that were really fun. But when I got there, I couldn't explain to anybody how to help me at all. So, I could say, okay. And that was about as much as I could communicate. They explained the order and stuff. So I started making these very, very simple things for the first time, pretty much. I often made simple things for myself, but it was just out of necessity. But what I realized when I started to make these kind of simple things, these works, by the way, are for the first exhibition that I ever had of vessels. Everything that I made before this, everything that I ever exhibited, not that I made, everything I ever exhibited before this was a sculpture. And when I was in the States, that's what my main focus was. Glass was a primary component of that. But what I had realized after I started to make these things and use them in my house is that when I had a nice goblet and I had a nice simple glass, I tended to opt towards the thing that I actually wanted to use happened to be the simple glass. And I started to realize that most of the things that I had made because I enjoyed making them, and not necessarily because I enjoyed seeing them or touching them or experiencing them in use. And so what's happened during my time in Japan is my direction has shifted in that direction. I've aligned with that direction, I should say. So these are simple, flat vases. They're about an inch deep, about 6 or 7 inches wide. There's 2 vases. The idea that I had was that Tokyo is quite narrow. There's not a lot of room to put stuff in your house. There were 2 things that were involved in the design of these, and one of them I was really getting into windows and the idea of making window glass and window-like things. And so there was that. And the other one was just actually the physical constraints of the space that people had to put stuff in. So this could be basically like up against a wall. It didn't need to take up a lot of space, but it could be large. But I started to get really interested in architecture in particular in Japan, and when I say architecture, I mean the way space is treated and the way, I'm not talking about the building itself, but the way the experience of being in the building is created on every level, from the way that you take your shoes off to go into a room or into a building, or just the way the building will be lined up so that shadows will come in at a certain angle or in a certain way across lines that juxtapose on the floor, or those kinds of things. So in terms of this idea of making things more simply, for me, I started to exhibit in these kinds of spaces, and I just didn't feel comfortable in a certain way putting in a bright orange and black twisted cane, relatively simple shape, but something that was so bright and so attractive because I felt like I didn't want to overplay the rest of the stuff that was happening in the room. I mean, this mat is also handmade. The walls are handmade. I mean, all this stuff was just as important to me as what I was doing, as what I was going to make. So I felt it would be ostentatious in a sense, and so I was really trying to start in these works, trying to figure out how I became interested in the material itself for the first time, really, as opposed to just the blowing process and the blowing history. And I started to try to look more carefully at the material and try to see more, and the process, try to see the characteristics that were inherent with that, as opposed to kind of impose my will on it and make a particular shape or something like that. So in these cases, I started to pay more attention to the things that happened as I was making something, the details. Like, it might be hard to see a little bit, but the jack marks or the lines from the tools are running up and down here and also over here. In Japanese architecture, there's this particular attention paid to being able to see a certain amount of information, but not being able to see everything. For example, in a restaurant, there may be a window, but this portion of it will be whited out. So light can come in, and we can see above, we can see the sky, we can see the ground, but you can't see someone's face, for example. I begin interested in those things. And also the material itself and the characteristics of glass and what kind of power they have or what kind of effect that they have in the process itself. So in this case, this building, it's called Furukawa Bijizukan, which means a Furukawa Museum, and it's a classic old house, a very rich person's house apparently, and it's all made out of wood, of course, and the wood itself, the grain and everything was something that I responded to heavily. And as well, there's a small stream that's been constructed and runs underneath the house, so there's water, and so I started to try to think about how can I approach those things with this material. So you can see, for example, right around here, this looks similar to this piece of wood. I started to think about those things. It looks like water or ice, but you can tell that it tells you about the material in the process, and then it looks like something that's been stretched out as well. I started to look for these kind of relationships for the first time. The next group of slides are sculptures that I produced at that time that were more, the vessel itself had become more primary as an artistic form. And I also started to notice these similarities between the things I was interested in making vessels and the way that I wanted to use them in sculptures. And very interested in, as I said, kind of the technology of it. And when I say technology, it's because the Japanese word for technology is gijutsu. But that's also the Japanese word for craft, and it's also the Japanese word for skill. So the word gijutsu is a word it's a category above technology, craft, and skill. It's a word that I'm not really aware of if we have one in English. But anyway, I'll keep saying technology, but I mean glass blowing in this case. You can see here how this little spot right here, for those of you who are not glass blowers, is where the glass is first touched down and then wrapped around. And those little details, like the way it trapped that little piece of air in there around that touchdown point, those types of things have become really important to me. And I think part of the reason is because as a maker of things, I have a great interest in how things have been made. And whenever I see a piece of glass, especially an older piece of glass that's using some sort of technology, some kind of craft or skill that's no longer in use or that we don't know about, I'm always looking for these clues. So to me, to leave these clues has become really important. This is a small picture, but it has this stone incorporated into it, which causes the piece to crack in half. So there's a line that goes down, let's see if it goes down here, comes across the bottom and comes back up. That's a crack. But it's being held back, the two halves are being held together by this weight, which is pulling down on this, which is pulling these wires together. And I see these things, and I don't have a conscious decision-making process so much. For me, it's more the process of making is about making my decisions conscious. So for me, this was kind of like an image of a solar event, like a comet, say, for example, the path of a comet, which happens to be the title. The point I wanted to make with this slide in particular was that I found myself increasingly interested in the most minute of details in my sculpture, and as well, more and more so now, in the vessels that I make, because I feel like if there's a really extremely minute detail and then something even more minute, one can lead you to the next, which can lead you to an even more minute place. And it changes a person's sense of scale. It puts them into the work. For example, I don't know how visible it is, but in this piece, this was also a repair. Maybe you can see that this side of the glass is dirty, and the other side is perfectly clean. This is an insect. This actually is covered with, what you can see up at the very top corner there, my fingerprints. Just oil and fingerprints. My goal kind of being that each small detail draws you to a smaller detail and so on. Anyway, I made those sculptures at the same time, basically. And this is about the time that I finished teaching after 5 years. And I made my own studio for the first time. I'd always worked at schools. I'd never had my own studio. So I made my own studio, and these works are the first works that I ever produced from my own studio. My own studio was constructed very particularly to make a certain kind of work. So it really is a big part of what I do now. At this point, like I said, my wife got this great job, and she was also pregnant. So I quit my job with the idea that I would become a house husband, more or less, and that when I had time, I would start to build my studio, and as the children, or child at that time, got older and I had a little bit more time here and there, I would eventually start to work again. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. That was the presentation titled Where I Was. And here's where I am now, where I live. This is Toyama, Japan. This is my house that we rent. And behind that is my studio. And I am standing up the hill at the temple, looking out. And those mountains across there, you'll see a better picture of that in a minute, is the Tateyama mountain range. Basically, In Japan, or at least in the Japan areas that I'm familiar with, there is no what we would call rural. There's no place where you go out and there's a house, and then another 2 miles down the road there's another house with farmland in between. There are basically concentrations of small houses with rice fields and then small houses with rice fields. And this is what they call inaka. But there's a mall within 2 kilometers of here, but it's considered more or less countryside to most people in Japan. So here you can see this is just the edge of the little group of houses that is our area, and then a rice field, and then several groups, and then more rice fields. And in these kind of pockets where the older culture still remains, it's really a special time to be there, because with the generation of people that are old now, the generation of people that were born just before the war or slightly before the war, or even just after, I suppose, but they're connected to thousands of years of direct line in terms of making and living and how they live, seikatsu, which is living, livelihood, life. But since the war, everything's changing very, very quickly. So this guy is my neighbor. We call him Seijun Papa. He's just great. Anyway, the point I wanted to make with these next set of slides is that I just stood at my studio and turned around in 5 minutes and took pictures of everything that I saw that was made by hand, just to give you an idea of the influence that I've kind of unconsciously had from being in this area, in this place. So Seijun Papa here doesn't have a car, he has a scooter. He's probably never been out of Toyama, and he made that ladder that he's using right there, and he's going to work on a building that he also made. And this is the fence next to our house. Nothing special, right? It's just bamboo. But he would go cut the bamboo, slice it, get the rope, tie it up. He could go buy something if he didn't just have a scooter, but he could get someone to bring it to him. But instead of doing that, even though it takes time, he chose to make it. Now, I'm not about to say that this is some very special craft item that is. In fact, my point is that what's important about this is that it's not like a high-level craft item. It's a very everyday occurrence in this area. This is his garden. Everything in this square of land that he has, aside from the building of the house itself, everything that's outside has been shaped by him. Every single square centimeter. He has taken care of his garden, everything. He's out there every day. And I wanted to make this kind of interesting point because it was just last week. I was riding my bicycle home after taking the kids to school, and I came across one of my neighbors, this woman. She's, I would say, about 75 or 80. She was out in her garden. And it was a beautiful garden, and she had all these vegetables and flowers and all this stuff. And I said, boy, this must take some time, take care of this all the time. She's like, oh, she works at the doctor's office. And she said to me, yeah, the garden, it takes a lot of time. It takes so much time. I don't have time to work. I just smiled right away because I would have said probably, or I do say, I have said, and I've heard friends say, and many people say, well, I wish I had time to work in the garden. I don't have time to work in the garden because I have to work. But for her, she doesn't have time to work because she has to work in the garden. So I just think that's an interesting difference that, for me, it was important to be aware of, that way of thinking. This is for the snow. The point I want to get across about this guy and his property is just that he wakes up in the morning and goes out and starts using his hands all the time for everything he does. And I just think that's so admirable. And I just think that direct relationship between what he needs to have for life and the fact that he makes as much of it as possible it's just something that's fading away, and it's not something that I really didn't experience when I lived in the States so much, and it's just really valuable to me. Now, as I turn around, this is our door. These are brooms that were made by my landlord's father. My landlord doesn't make them, and his son doesn't make them, but my landlord's father made them, and his father made them, and so on. So this is just now ending this idea. This is the bucket that I use in my studio for the blocks. This is a rice measuring bucket. Just why the top edge is steel, because they can scrape across it with the straight edge and level off the rice, so it's exactly 100 of a particular unit. And here's another object, a very crude object made by hand. It's like a mallet type of device. But in contrast to that, across the street is this amazing building, which I wouldn't say is entirely made by hand, but a very large portion of it is. I have this in my studio. This is full-size, fully to scale, like maybe a Winchester, I'm not sure, but it's a toy gun that a guy made. A friend of mine was throwing this away. And, this guy was an electrician. There's the barrel. It's a piece of EMT, right? The tubing for the wires and such. I just think it's so cool. I mean, this guy just made a toy instead of buying one. And there was a time when this was the only choice. But even this guy had a choice of buying one and didn't. And I just think that's a significant point. Now, this object and the next object are kind of interesting to me because these are what I kind of think of as in-between technologies. This is an old technology using new materials. So this is a traditional shaped basket that's been made with stainless mesh and stainless wire and bamboo for the handle. Of course, it would have been made with sticks and reed basketry materials in the past. We're using this in the studio. And this is one of my favorite objects. This is a basket that's woven out of rolled up fertilizer bags. Even 15 years ago, it would have been made out of natural materials, but they're recycling, reusing this stuff. And this is just some old lady. She just, like, what can I do? I've got this stuff. I've got this time. If she was to calculate how much money she was going to make per hour doing this and follow that reasoning, she would never be doing this at all. But I think it's so beautiful. This is my studio building, the inside, and this is more or less traditional way for the framing, where they, with these rough hewn logs, and some of them are curved, they get the materials first and then decide how they're going to stack them up. So each one is different. The reason I'm showing this one in particular, even though it's not really old and special and museum-like, is because it's only about 30 years old. So just 30 years ago they were doing this. They don't do it anymore. Here's the outside, so nothing special. So I'm going to start to show my studio just a little bit. This is the only place that we could find that had a house and an outbuilding that I could use, because there's lots of empty houses, but almost every outbuilding is being used for farming still. So I had to build this room to build the studio. I always had tools at schools when I worked at them, so I had to gather up all the tools and everything. And looking out from here, you can see my garden. It's been neglected. And this is from the bench. It's quite a nice, pleasant place to work. It's a very simple studio. There's 2 pieces of equipment. The furnace itself is designed for blowing out of. And the annealer on the right-hand side is also used as the pipe warmer and what we call the garage. So I didn't have a lot of space to work with. That was one consideration. But I'm a simple is good type of person, so I just tend to stick to that approach. This is the door system, as you can see. And this is the pipe warmer underneath. Well, you can't see it there, but the pipe warmer is here underneath the annealer, and it flues up into the annealer. And the annealer itself is just a simple pipe burner. Very, very, very low tech, very basic, and very, very easy. And everything in my studio I built for what I can do or what I want to do with it. So, for example, the size of the piece that I can make in the furnace is exactly the size that I can fit in the annealer, and the annealer will hold exactly how many of those I can make in a day. And it's all custom to what I do. And the kind of heat that the furnace provides is key to the kind of work that I like to make. Okay, so let's talk about what I make, what I've done. For me, at some point after we moved, I started to spend a lot more time in the house and in the kitchen, cooking and cleaning and taking care of our daughter and doing regular stuff. That was just a great experience for a maker. It's something that if I had just continued teaching, I think I would have been at a loss in terms of understanding what I really want things to be like in the house, or what the way I want to eat, or the way I want to keep my food, or the way I want to prepare it, and those kinds of things. And since I make things that are related to food, it was kind of a seminal experience to just be at home and actually use the stuff all the time and think about from that point of view. Everything that I do now comes from this start, basically. And this start, what I mean by that is I made these things without ever thinking of exhibiting them or selling them or anything. I just I need a jar, and I need it to do this, and I need this size. And so I made it. And it was until later, until I thought, I've solved a problem for myself, and there are lots of other people that also have this same problem, so to speak, problem. And I should put these out in an exhibition and see if people respond to it. I'm going to go back for just a second and talk a little bit about this one point because it came up recently, and then I'm going to get back to what I was just talking about. But this is a soap bubble holder, and this is a work that I first made when I was a student, and I still make from time to time. In the middle is a soap bubble. And all it does is basically you shut it, and you blow the bubble in it with a straw, and you close it, and the bubble just sits there so you can watch it. I've showed examples of vessels, functional ware. It's a word I'm not entirely comfortable with because I always speak in Japanese now, but we say utsuwa. And I've showed examples of my sculpture, and there's this big overlap in those two areas for me, which I think is pretty obvious. But I recently was asked by a magazine when they came, how I can do that and do this at the same time. But for me, I couldn't differentiate between those two things very easily. So I set up this example. I have this cup here on the left, which is obviously a functional vessel, and the soap bubble holder on the right, which was obviously an artwork at first appearance. But the cup itself has this small crack in the lip that it cracked when it was hot. If you were to squeeze it, it would probably break quite easily. And washing it, setting it down, these things, it's quite fragile. It's quite easy to break. So in a certain way, it doesn't really follow the typical design rules for a form follows function or, that kind of philosophy. And the soap bubble holder, on the other hand, there's nothing extra about it in any kind of way. It only does what it needs to do, which is hold this bubble in a way without obstructing it in any way and keep it from popping. It does follow that dictum of form follows function 100% with no extras at all. It doesn't do anything outside of the function. So I said, which one of these things is a functional vessel and which one is an art piece? That was my question to her. And both of them are both things in a certain way. But I said, this one with the crack, while you can drink out of it, it's the crack itself that's the most expressive part of it. And I said, so it has more elements of an artwork or an object of art in a certain way. So anyway, I just thought I'd throw that out there. Because almost everybody looking at those two things in the first place would say, this belongs in this category and this belongs in that category. But with a little bit of thought, you can see that it's not so clear at all. Okay, back to my current production stuff. Well, this is the pasta jar. You saw the first one, was in the first slide. You can see the lid was quite short, and it was actually a real pain to get the pasta. I had to turn it upside down and stuff. So my basic design process now is find something that I need, make it, use it, find out what doesn't work, redesign it, make it, use it again, and then put it out for other people to use and get their feedback. I always like to have the feedback of the customers and friends, etc. I always say pasta, the one on the right would be soba, one on the left would be somen, but they're for noodles. Originally designed for noodles. In actuality, they're all different lengths of somen. This is a stacking set that I designed for use in the kitchen for cooking. They're all stacked up. So maybe you mince garlic, get your other spices and everything all measured out, stack it up. It's all prepared, ready to go, and then you can start to cook. But we use this every day. We just use the top two for salt and pepper and keep it on the table. This is for what's called yakumi set, we say. But yakumi is when you eat cold noodles, like you dip it in the sauce and slurp it up. You always have negi, scallion, and maybe wasabi or shoga, ginger, those kinds of things, and you mix that into the sauce. So the idea is that you prepare those things, put the lid on it, put it in the fridge, and pull it out nice and cold and use it. I think I have an example. Here they are separated. So what I'm trying to do at that point, and still now, is find this intersection of where the process that I enjoy, the process that I'm curious about, overlap with the function and try to find that balance. And as I was saying earlier about trying to make pieces that could be in balance with their surroundings, my goal for these things is that they aren't completed objects unto themselves, but they're completed in use. Because to me, food is much more beautiful than glass. I want it to work in concert with that event of eating or preparing or whatever it is that the vessel is used for. Another thing that I was starting to think about that's been interesting for me is applying these ideas to modern life. I would buy a nice bowl and I would make delicious food, or at least beautiful, maybe not delicious, and I put it in the fridge, but I have to put saran wrap on it. I always felt like that one item was really out of place. I didn't like it. So I feel like what I'm trying to do is address modern issues like putting things in the fridge in some small ways. This is basically the same thing, it's just stretched out, right? But this is for shochu. This is basically to carry to the park and drink. Shochu is like a vodka. And those are the umeboshi, which is the sour pickled plums. But you can turn the inside cup upside down, for example, and then you have space up to about here for lemonade or something else if you wanted to. The whole wire assembly, you lift up this one bar that's up here, this thing, and then the thing can angle out and swing off, and then you just take it off and it's out of the way. So you have your pitcher and your two cups. This is pretty indicative of the tumblers that I make a lot of now. And I'll just go through these fairly quickly. These are sculptures that I made at the same time, but the reason that I put them in really is just to show further the relationship for me. Both those disciplines, if you want to call them, or those categories, they really feed each other for me. I hope that eating is an artistic experience, and using something as an artistic experience as much as a sculpture provides. This is, again, another broken and repaired piece. It's actually repaired by the force of these two magnets. It's called Three Gaps. It actually isn't broken. The line goes from here down to here, and then it stops, and then it starts again over here and comes back up. And there's a gap, obviously. That's one gap. There's one gap between the magnets. And then there's this line that's carved around the exterior circumference there that a friend of mine was using to practice on the wheel. She studied engraving from high school. But she couldn't get it to line up, so she didn't finish the line, so there's another gap. This piece is called Kido, which is an orbit of a heavenly body. I got into making these things with the stones in them because I could never figure out, I couldn't predict in any way the way that they were going to break. And I felt I wanted to give up some control over the direction, over what the piece was going to be, because I just enjoy the challenge, and I'm not really interested in making the same thing so often, which is ironic because that's what I do with my vesselware. But this piece also had a stone in it, and now the stone is hanging in the middle on this thing right here, and this is the hole that it left behind. The other thing that I really liked about it, actually, about these things, was if you break a piece of glass, it looks like a violent thing happened. But if you put the stone in, between the layers of the glass, the crack comes out naturally and it makes the most beautiful lines. And doesn't have that feeling of being broken. It's like watching something grow. another piece that was broken and repaired. This time it's repaired with wire and copper and solder. So I started to think about those lines and think about this in terms of a design process. And I also did a series with Lara Simika, who's the cold worker that I was referring to earlier, the engraver, where I would make two of something. One would be broken, and then I would turn the other one to her, and she would carve the exact same line as the crack with the engraving, which is just an incredible feat. It took 14 different wheels to do this bottle. She also did these cups for me. And they appear to be broken. Most people think they're broken, but they're not. And finally, this piece, which was called Fragmentia, another kind of repair. And when I did this particular exhibition, I also became very interested in the shadows that these things made, because they're all lit with a single spot. So when I would place the work on the pedestal, I didn't put the work in the middle. I put the work and the shadow in the middle. And I really started to pay attention to the shadows themselves, because they revealed so much information that you couldn't see in the glass. And so I started to make a series of cyanotypes, which I'm still working on now. This is a piece that Lada has engraved for me. It was based on a piece that was broken. And then from here on, the slides consist entirely of the stuff that I've been working on for the last 2.5 years or so. These are the 3 colors that we use in my studio. The color accuracy is not so great. And these are solid paperweights. The one on the right is gray, and the one in the middle is what we call jueki, which means wood water, and the one on the left is green. And they all have gray in them, but the one on the left is green, which is just basically we take wine bottles and crush them up and mix them in. And these are the current works that I produce in my studio. This is what we call nagazara, which means long plate. And as I was talking about earlier, I like it when there's clues for people to look at, the people that are owning these things or using them, seeing them, to understand the process and maybe something about the quality or characteristics of the material. So the one thing I really like about this is that you can see the fold. It's just a cut plate. Here's the final iteration of the pasta jar we make. Well, you can see the wire in the next one. Basically, when you lift up this hoop right here, it extends the length of this thing and allows you to move it out of the way and take the lid off. It's the same mechanism as a vice grip or any of those cam lock things that you shut a box with. I've also really enjoyed taking photographs recently myself. Like, every aspect of what I do holds the same level of importance, and I like to be able to pay the same level of attention to the details. Just a simple plate with a folded foot. And rice jars and whatnot we have several different sizes that I make. It's one that we use every day in home for coffee. Larger ones for rice or oatmeal or other grains, cereal, and then quite large ones which are sometimes used for making pickles. People always tell me what they use them for. It's always interesting to see what kind of uses they come across. This is a detail of how the wire is connected. And this is just so you can get an idea of the size of this particular jar. Part of the idea for the workshop that I'm going to be doing in the next few days came from starting to be really concerned or interested in the kind of mark that the punty would leave. In this case, it just happens to be a P, which is great since my name is Peter. But, I don't really expect anybody to ever notice that. And that's not really what I want people to notice. But it's kind of like this childish dream of mine that someday this thing is unearthed and they can tell from the mark that it was made in my studio by the mark of the punty itself or something like that. Anyways, I like that kind of stuff a lot. Another detail shot of the way the lid is held down. I really love making my work, and I'm in such a great place with it because I don't get tired of doing the same thing over and over because I'm always getting better at it. Every time I'm getting better at learning something, it's getting easier, it hurts less, my body, whatever it is. But I'm also free to drop anything at any time and do something else. And it's just really a wonderful place to be. The short goblet, we call it short cup. Plate. These are the kind of bubbles I like to make. I was really envious of ceramics in some way when I started to learn more about ceramics in Japan, but in particular I was envious of it because it was so obviously a material that was just taken right from the earth, that had that mundane quality to it. And I guess I've become interested in giving more opportunities for people to think about glass as a material by putting a little stone in it or putting bubbles in it or using the stretching process to make things. It's that same plate. Again, it's one of my favorite punty marks. And then most recently, I started to work with a wood maker, design these plates. This is a plate for cold soba, cold noodles, and it's made from canes, from bars, basically, that are pulled out. And they're slats. There's space between each one, and it allows the water to drop off the food so that the noodles don't get soft. It's very fun to make this stuff. And to think about it and to see it realized and then to see someone else get excited about it and take it home and use it is just very satisfying for me. Another thing that's been very interesting for me in terms of exhibiting in Japan is that when you do an exhibition in Japan, generally you are at the exhibition, at least for some period of time. So you meet the customers directly. And that's one thing that I found to be really important, that I really enjoy. At first I thought, how can I go to the exhibition? How am I going to make work? I can't do both at the same time, but it turns out to be a really important thing for me because I'm the only one that can explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. And if they ask a question to someone that works at the store or at the gallery, like, what is this part? Why is this piece of glass stuck in here? Or the gallery person doesn't know about, the fact that Roman glass often had the puntee broken off inside, or that these were bars of glass that were stretched out. And so they might know some of what I've told them, but not only that, but talking with the customers, I can tell them why I'm doing what I'm doing, and they can tell me what they like about it. Or I have a good regular base of customers that they're not just buying this object. They're interested in what I'm doing, and they're interested in what I'm going to do. It's a bigger picture. They're not just buying this thing. They're involving themselves in these ideas or in this kind of culture. I'm not saying it's 100% pure in that way. It's not. Anyway. Another square plate. And this one is just the rhythm of the grain of the wood. And then above this, the reflection is surare. It's reeds. It's a reed covering just for a little shade. And the look of that, like a flowing kind of river, or, these kinds of rich things that are just happening entirely due to the process. It's not something that I have added in any kind of way. Not that that's a bad thing or anything. That's just where I'm at with it. This is oju is the term for this vessel, and it's for osechi, which is the New Year's meal. It's comprised of, maybe 10 or 15 little small dishes that are all put together and arranged inside of a 2-layer box. And I made this one with the kind of in reference again, of course, to windows, but transparent layers, and I can't wait to use it. But someone bought it. I have to make another one, so. Anyway, and this is the last slide. You can see a leaf there. I just put a leaf in there so you can see a little bit the effect that the glass would have in terms of the way the food would look, the kind of visual layer that it applies. And this is the last thing I made, so this is the end of the slides. Thank you very much.